President Biden is back on the campaign trail today after delivering a defiant State of the Union address on Capitol Hill last night. Standing before a divided Congress and with less than 8 months before the general election, Biden touted his administration's work on the economy and the border and defending democracy. He also drew stark contrast between himself and Donald Trump, without ever saying his name. So we have team coverage for you, of course, of all the highlights and the fallout from last night's address. We're going to begin on Capitol Hill, though, with CBS News White House reporter Willie James Inman. Willie, good morning.
Hey there, Anne-Marie. Good morning to you. In a fiery and energetic speech last night, President Biden sought to draw the path forward for the country ahead of what could be a contentious election battle.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
President Biden came out swinging in an election year State of the Union address, hitting many of the key issues on voters' minds, like his age.
The issue facing our nation isn't how old we are, it's how old are our ideas.
Reproductive rights.
I'll restore Roe v. Wade as the law of the land again.
The economy and immigration.
We need to act now.
The president sometimes sparred with Republican lawmakers, like this response to Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene over the killing of a young Georgia woman, allegedly by a suspect who illegally entered the U.S. from Venezuela.
Lincoln Riley, an innocent young woman who was killed by an illegal.
The president also took on his likely 2024 GOP rival, former President Donald Trump, referring to him as my predecessor 13 times.
What's happened now is a horror show.
Trump slammed the address on social media, calling it, quote, an angry, polarizing, and hate-filled speech, while Alabama Senator Katie Britt delivered the official GOP response with her kitchen as the backdrop.
President Biden just doesn't get it.
On foreign policy, Biden vowed to stand up to Russian President Vladimir Putin. As pro-Palestinian protesters stood outside the Capitol, inside, the president announced plans to build a temporary port to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza, and he pledged to bring Israeli hostages taken by Hamas home.
Meanwhile, President Biden will hit the campaign trail today, traveling to the great city of Philadelphia over the weekend. He's expected to travel to Georgia for a campaign event. He's really going to get that testing that message on the road as we are months away from the November election. Anne-Marie?
I like how you called it the great city of Philadelphia. Willie James Inman, thank you very much. All right, so for more on all of this, especially the foreign policy highlights, I want to bring in CBS News contributor Samantha Vinograd. She is in Washington. She's a former assistant secretary for terrorism and threat prevention. So good to see you again. So, the rebuttal from the Republicans came from Katie Britt, and she tried to sort of paint the president as kind of weak, dithering, diminished. I thought it was interesting, though, that he started this speech with foreign policy, which is typically not how the State of the Union addresses usually start. Usually they start with domestic. And he had some very strong words when he was speaking about the war in Gaza. I want to play some sound.
This war has taken a greater toll on innocent civilians than all previous wars in Gaza combined. More than 30,000 Palestinians have been killed, most of whom are not Hamas.
Well, as you know, there are many different audiences for the State of the Union, both foreign and domestic. These were strong words that were both supportive but critical of Israel. What impact do you see this messaging having?
Well, Anne-Marie, it's good to see you. For starters, I think it's really important to come back to a point that you made about President Biden starting with foreign policy, starting with Ukraine, which really means starting with Russia. And that's because the threat that Russia poses to our country is so existential. And if Congress does not pass supplemental funding for Ukraine, that doesn't just harm Ukraine, that hurts Ukraine's neighbors and ultimately makes Putin feel so empowered that puts American national security directly at risk. And that is a stark contrast between President Biden and President Trump. I'll say his name even though President Biden didn't, because the former president would bow down to President Putin. And President Biden clearly saying we will not bow down to Putin is so important for American national security. Now, on the Middle East, President Biden did speak for the first time at great length about the scale of suffering in Gaza. At the same time, he struck a very important balance by noting that this all started because of Hamas's terrorist attack, sexual violence, and taking of hostages. His announcement about opening a port in Gaza is a recognition of the inability of the United States to get Israel to allow enough aid in through border crossings. And while the administration works to negotiate a ceasefire and a return of hostages and humanitarian aid through border crossings, this port, which will take a few weeks, as I understand, will help alleviate the near starvation of 570,000 people.
Mm-hmm. And now I want to pick up what you sort of started with, what the president had to say about the war between Ukraine and Russia. I want to play some sound.
If anybody in this room thinks Putin will stop at Ukraine, I assure you he will not. Ukraine can stop Putin if we stand with Ukraine and provide the weapons that needs to defend itself.
So, Samantha, we heard the president again say that Ukraine needs more aid, that the money needs to flow. But what we didn't hear was how that money would be used. What you get from critics a lot is, yeah, you know, we've already sent billions and billions of dollars in military aid. What's the strategy, or is this a bottomless pit? Was that sort of missing from this speech?
I don't think so. I don't think the State of the Union is really a place for the president to get into the kind of military operational plans that his Secretary of Defense and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff will be briefing to their counterparts, both at NATO. We had Sweden join yesterday, which is a major success, and through other diplomatic and defense channels all around the world. What I was really focused on last night was not just the content of the State of the Union, but from a foreign policy perspective, arguably one of the most important facets of the speech was President Biden's delivery. The fact that the president, who has been described by the special counsel and by others as feeble and forgetful, came and gave a 67-minute speech that shows that he is here to play on the world stage. And when he was talking about American leadership, his delivery was credible, and his strong statements about standing with Ukraine, yes, for the sake of Ukraine, but also for the sake of American national security, was credible because of how strongly he was able to deliver those messages.
Right. Samantha Vinograd, thank you very much.
Thanks.
In November, my team began serious negotiation with a bipartisan group of senators. That bipartisan bill would hire 1,500 more security agents and officers, 100 more immigration judges to help tackle the backload of 2 million cases, 4,300 more asylum officers, and new policies so they can resolve cases in 6 months instead of 6 years.
President Biden blasted Republicans last night over the failed bipartisan border plan. He went off script, accusing the House GOP of derailing the proposal. Biden forcefully called on lawmakers to stop playing politics and approve a new plan. So Camilo Montoya-Galvez has been following all of this from Eagle Pass, Texas. Is joining us now. So Camilo, when I was listening to what he had to say about the border and his focus on Republicans and essentially suggesting that they are deliberately holding up bipartisan legislation that leans more conservative because they're playing politics. All I kept on thinking of was you've been covering this for a long time now. I consider you an expert. What jumped out at you on this topic in that speech?
Good morning, Anne-Marie. In many ways, President Biden last night sought to flip the script on immigration, which, as you know, is an incredibly vexing issue for many presidents, but especially his administration, which has faced a record number of migrants trying to enter the U.S. illegally over the past 3 years. President Biden last night forcefully called on Republican lawmakers to approve that bipartisan legislation, Anne-Marie, that his administration brokered with a small group of senators in recent weeks, and he in many ways challenged them to back policies that they have long demanded in Congress under Republican and Democratic administrations. The president noted that that bipartisan agreement would grant him the sweeping power to shut down asylum processing here along the U.S.-Mexico border when the number of illegal crossings spike. And he did not name the former president, as he underscored, former President Trump, but he directly accused the former president of derailing this deal for political reasons. I do have to underscore, Anne-Marie, that of course the president faces an uphill battle in convincing a gridlock Congress on moving on immigration legislation, one of the most deeply polarizing issues in America. After all, Congress has not passed a major immigration law since the 1990s.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to sort of ask you about, because, you know, it's kind of pointing the finger at, well, so I understand that this is a State of the Union address, but it's also a bit of a political speech, right? We are sort of in the middle of a political campaign. If the president doesn't get cooperation from Republicans on bipartisan legislation, does he have any place else to go?
He has his executive authority on this issue, Anne-Marie, and certainly he is looking at that authority right now to potentially take some sweeping actions here at the U.S.-Mexico border. Sources familiar with these deliberations within the administration tell us, Anne-Marie, that the president is weighing whether to invoke a sweeping presidential authority to drastically limit asylum here. That would involve him invoking an authority known as 212F that was used multiple times by former President Donald Trump, including to justify that infamous travel ban against migrants from certain predominantly Muslim countries. But I would have to underscore again that just like former President Trump, if President Biden moves forward with this plan, it would almost certainly be challenged in court.
All right, Camilo, thank you very much. Well, Donald Trump had some harsh criticism, as you can imagine, from Mr. Biden following the State of the Union address. But today, the former president is set to meet with Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. Orban will not be meeting with President Biden. It's a rare move for a NATO country's leader. Orban has faced criticism from the U.S. over democratic regressions and its friendly relationship with Russia. So CBS News campaign reporter Olivia Rinaldi joins us now. So before, you know, I want to talk a little bit about how we got here, because we say that it's a rare thing for a NATO member to do, but we're not talking about, okay, sorry, well, let me make a correction. I was about to dig into Orban. The president addressed, but not by name, his predecessor, Donald Trump, several times. Let's play a little sound for you.
Wasn't long ago when a Republican president named Ronald Reagan thundered, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Now my predecessor, a former Republican president, tells Putin, quote, "Do whatever the hell you want." That's a quote. A former president actually said that, bowing down to a Russian leader. I think it's outrageous, it's dangerous, and it's unacceptable.
So House Speaker Mike Johnson weighed in too. I want to play what we caught him saying after the address.
Speaker Johnson, what did you make of that speech?
That it was overly partisan.
We know Donald Trump was responding quite a bit on his social media platform. He was tweeting throughout the whole thing. So what did he have to say? And do Trump's sentiments about last night's address reflect the feelings of the larger Republican Party? I don't know. But what did he have to say?
Yeah, good morning, Anne-Marie. You saw Trump's responses on Truth Social, and he promised to be responding in real time to Biden's State of the Union. But actually, Truth Social went down for quite a bit right at the start of the speech and about midway through. So it was difficult to really glean Trump's responses throughout. But he responded on everything from comments about IVF and supporting IVF to Biden's appearance, his cough, his walk, all of these things as part of a broader effort to pivot towards this general election, especially after Nikki Haley dropped out earlier this week, that it's really about the vitality between these two men. So he was painting that sort of picture there last night. I also want to point out that MAGA Inc., which is the super PAC associated with Donald Trump, released an ad yesterday before the State of the Union that really talked about Biden's age and whether or not he could survive until 2029. So his comments on age were really underscored last night, and that's something that Republicans talked about as well. You could see some of that chatter online about them saying that Biden Biden was fierce and loud and vicious, which is a lot different than how he's normally described by Republicans, which is quiet demeanor, forgetting things, and not all there. So it was an interesting contrast last night. And tomorrow in Georgia, both Donald Trump and President Biden will be there holding campaign events as they start to kick off, really, this general election.
Yeah, I saw the former President Trump posting about how angry Joe Biden seemed and how anger could never unite the country. I thought it was quite interesting. But in the meantime, the Republican National Committee is set to elect a new chair. Trump may be expanding his influence. What do we know about today's vote?
Yeah, today is a crucial vote here in Houston where the Republican National Committee will be picking new leadership. And this is leadership that is backed by the former president. This all came about a few weeks ago when there was quite a lot of support among the Republican Party to oust current chair Ronna McDaniel. So she will be stepping down today, and there will be a vote where North Carolina GOP Chairman Michael Whatley and Trump's daughter-in-law, Lara Trump, will take the helm of the RNC. And this is part of that pivot to the general election. It's the consolidation of the Republican Party around Trump. And also a key advisor to Trump, Chris LaCivita, will be staying on the campaign, but he will become effectively the chief operating officer of the RNC. And what that does is gives them greater coordination between the campaign and the party apparatus. That means more money, more fundraising, more ads that they can put together as this effort to re-elect President Trump. So that's something we'll be watching here today. But yes, Trump did have a hand in this. He handpicked these people to represent, and it's part of this effort to coalesce the party around him and focus on that re-election campaign.
All right, Olivia, thank you.